I want to share with you today something that has been vital in my own walk with the Lord. There have been many moments in my life, in ministry, where the road ahead seemed uncertain, where the path I needed to take was unclear. And I know many of you have faced times in your own lives when you felt the weight of uncertainty, when you wondered how you would continue, and when you didn't have the answers you were hoping for. The Christian life is not always one of clear roads and bright signs telling us where to go. Sometimes we are left to walk by faith, to step out when we can't see the next step ahead. The Bible tells us to walk by faith, not by sight. But what does that really mean? How do we walk by faith when the road ahead seems dark and uncertain? I have had to wrestle with these questions, and I want to share the answers I've found, rooted in the Word of God. I remember vividly a moment in my ministry when I was faced with an opportunity that I believed God had put before me. But as I prayed and sought counsel, the road ahead seemed foggy. I didn't know how things would unfold, and there were so many variables outside of my control. I'm sure many of you have been there. You feel the call, but you can't see the full picture. In those moments, it can be so easy to slip into anxiety, to want to take control, to demand that God show us the way. We want to have everything mapped out, and if we're honest, we want the comfort of knowing that the future is secure. But God doesn't always give us the answers we want, and He doesn't always give us the clarity we desire. I remember praying in that time of uncertainty, asking God, "Lord, why can't I see the road ahead? Why does it feel like I'm walking blindfolded?" And as I sat there in prayer, I felt the Lord whisper in my heart, "You are not meant to see the road ahead, because the road is not the point. The point is trusting in me as you walk it." That was a defining moment for me, one that shaped my understanding of faith in a way I had never grasped before. Faith is not about having all the answers, it's about trusting the one who holds the answers. In 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7, Paul writes, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." This verse has always been a cornerstone of my understanding of walking with God. Faith is not about seeing, it's about trusting in the unseen, in the things that are not yet clear, but are guaranteed because of the character of God. We don't need to know everything, we need to know Him. And knowing Him means trusting His character and His promises, even when the road ahead is shrouded in mystery. The life of Abraham provides a powerful example of what it means to walk by faith, especially when we can't see the road ahead. In Genesis 12 verse 1, God calls Abraham to leave his country, his family, and everything he knew, to go to a land that God would show him. Now, imagine that. God calls Abraham to leave his home, with no destination in sight. Abraham didn't know where he was going, he didn't know how the promise would unfold. And yet, what does the scripture say? Abraham went. He obeyed. He trusted God with the unknown. He didn't have a map, a timeline, or a clear picture of what the future would hold, but he had something far greater, a deep trust in the faithfulness of the one who had called him. I've often thought about how difficult that must have been for Abraham. To pack up everything he knew and set out on a journey with nothing but God's promise. But Abraham walked by faith, not by sight. He trusted that God, who had called him, would lead him. This is exactly what we are called to do in our own lives. Faith doesn't mean we know everything, it means we trust the one who knows everything. Let's think for a moment about what it means to walk by faith in our day-to-day lives. I'll be honest with you, it's not easy. We like to plan, we like to have control. We want to know what will happen tomorrow, the next month, or even the next year. But God often asks us to step out when we don't know what will happen. Walking by faith means we trust God with the unknowns, even when it feels uncomfortable. And that's exactly where God wants us, learning to trust Him more than we trust our own understanding. The Apostle Peter provides another example of walking by faith in Matthew 14 verses 28 to 31. When Jesus walked on water toward the disciples, Peter called out, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus simply said, "Come." Peter, in faith, stepped out of the boat, walking toward Jesus on the water. But when he saw the wind and the waves, he began to sink. Why? because he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the storm around him. The moment Peter lost his focus on Jesus, he started to sink. The storm didn't stop, but Peter's faith wavered. Jesus, in his mercy, immediately reached out his hand and saved Peter, saying, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" This moment is a powerful reminder that walking by faith isn't about being free from storms. It's not about finding a life without trials or difficulties. Walking by faith means we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, even when the storms of life are all around us. When the road ahead is unclear, when the difficulties seem overwhelming, faith is about fixing our eyes on Christ, trusting that He will lead us, and believing that He will be faithful, no matter the circumstances. I'm reminded of a time when I was personally facing a storm in my life, a situation that seemed impossible, a challenge that seemed insurmountable. I could easily have been overwhelmed by the fear and uncertainty. But the Lord impressed upon my heart that walking by faith meant focusing on Him, not the problem. It was in those moments that I had to remind myself that faith is not about understanding the details, it's about trusting the one who knows every detail. I didn't know what was ahead, but I knew that God was faithful, and I knew that He would guide me through it. And He did. In conclusion, walking by faith when you can't see the road ahead requires trusting in God's character, obeying His call, and keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus. We are not called to have all the answers, but to trust that God knows the way. Even when the road is unclear, we can walk forward in confidence because we walk with the one who knows the future. When we choose to walk by faith, we are choosing to trust God with the unknowns of life, knowing that He is good, He is faithful, and He will guide us every step of the way. So, I encourage you today, as you face the uncertainties in your own life, step out in faith, trust God's leading, and keep your eyes on Him. When you do, you will find that the road ahead, though unseen, will be filled with His presence, His guidance, and His peace. In the Christian life, we are often called to walk in faith, even when we can't see the road ahead. When I think back on my own journey, I recall several times when God asked me to step out, not knowing exactly where I was going or how everything would unfold. One of the most profound lessons I've learned over the years is that walking by faith is not about seeing the entire road, but about trusting God to guide each step. The path may be unclear, but God's presence and His promises are clear, and that's what we must rely on. I remember a time in my early ministry when I was confronted with a difficult decision. I was presented with an opportunity that seemed promising, but there were many unknowns. I had no idea how things would work out, and I didn't have all the answers. I was wrestling with uncertainty, trying to discern whether this was God's will for me. I sought counsel from trusted friends, prayed earnestly, and looked for signs. But the road was still foggy. There was no bright neon sign telling me what to do next. It was in those moments of uncertainty that I began to understand that walking by faith doesn't mean knowing everything. It's about trusting God even when we don't have all the answers, and even when the road ahead is hidden from our view. I learned that faith is not about clarity or control, it's about obedience. When I faced that moment of decision, I knew that God was calling me to trust Him, even though I couldn't see the outcome. This is what it means to walk by faith. It's a step-by-step trust in God's leading, believing that He will reveal what is needed when the time is right. In Hebrews 11, we read about the great hall of faith, where many of the heroes of the faith are listed. These men and women walked by faith in some of the most difficult circumstances. One of the most striking examples is that of Abraham. In Genesis 12 verse 1, God called Abraham to leave his country and his family and go to a land that He would show him. Abraham didn't know where he was going. He didn't have the full map in front of him, but he obeyed. He took that first step, and the next one, and the next, all while trusting in God's promise to lead him. Abraham didn't see the full picture, but he trusted the one who had called him. As I reflect on this story, I see how it mirrors our own lives. God doesn't always give us the whole blueprint of our journey. He doesn't lay out every step in advance. We often want God to show us the full road, to give us certainty about the future, but that's not how faith works. God calls us to trust Him with the little steps, knowing that He will reveal His will as we move forward. In Psalm 119 verse 105, we are reminded that, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." God doesn't promise to shine a spotlight on the whole journey, He promises to light the next step. That's what faith is all about, trusting God with the step that's right in front of us, even when we don't know where it will lead. I've also realized that faith is not a passive activity. It's not just sitting back and waiting for God to move, it's an active choice to follow, even when we don't have all the details. I remember a time in my life when I was faced with a major career decision. It wasn't just about the job itself, it was about whether or not to stay where I was comfortable or to step out into a new challenge that I wasn't sure I was ready for. The decision didn't have clear answers. I was torn between two paths, and neither seemed to be the perfect one. But I knew in my heart that God was asking me to trust Him and step forward. It was hard to move forward in the uncertainty, but I knew I had to make that choice in faith. When we choose to follow God in those moments of uncertainty, it's an act of faithful obedience. Walking by faith requires courage, but it also requires humility. We have to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. We have to let go of our need for control and trust God with the unknowns. There is a spiritual tension that comes with this kind of faith. On one hand, we want certainty and security. We want to know exactly what's going to happen and when. But on the other hand, God calls us to step out in faith, to trust Him in the unknown, and to believe that He will work all things together for good. It's not easy, but it's in these moments that we grow deeper in our trust in God's provision and guidance. In James 1 verse 5, James encourages us, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." When the road ahead is unclear, we can ask God for wisdom. God promises to give us the wisdom we need to make decisions. He doesn't leave us in the dark. But even with wisdom, we must still take the step of faith. We must trust that God will lead us in the right direction, even when we don't have all the answers. This brings me to another important point. Faith is about moving forward, even when the outcome is not certain. I remember a time when I was called to lead a ministry in an unfamiliar territory, and the road was far from clear. There were many unknowns, and I didn't have a concrete plan. But I had one thing: God's call. And that was enough. We often look for signs or guarantees before we take action. But God doesn't always give us that kind of certainty. He simply asks us to trust Him with what we know and take the next step, even when we can't see the full picture. The Apostle Peter also gives us an incredible example of walking by faith in Matthew 14 verse 29. When Jesus was walking on the water toward His disciples, Peter asked Jesus to command him to come out of the boat and walk to him. Jesus simply said, "Come." Peter stepped out of the boat, walking on water toward Jesus. But when he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind, he began to sink. Peter's faith was not about walking on water, it was about keeping his eyes on Jesus, trusting that Jesus would sustain him. When he lost focus, he began to sink. But Jesus immediately reached out His hand and saved him. Jesus didn't let Peter fall. He was there, ready to catch him. This is an important lesson for us. Walking by faith means keeping our eyes on Jesus, no matter how strong the winds of doubt or fear may blow. When we focus on the uncertainty and the challenges around us, we lose sight of the one who is leading us. Our faith must be centered on Christ and His promises. He is the one who holds us steady. When we keep our eyes fixed on Him, we will be able to walk forward in faith, even when the road ahead is unclear. In conclusion, walking by faith when you can't see the road ahead requires us to trust God completely, to follow His guidance, and to keep our eyes on Him. We don't need to see the whole road, we just need to take the next step. God is faithful, and He will lead us through every uncertain moment. Trust Him with the journey, knowing that He has already gone before us. Take the next step in faith, and watch how He will reveal the next one. God's path is always the best path, even when we can't see it clearly. As we conclude our series on walking by faith when the road ahead seems unclear, I want to leave you with a final thought, one that I believe will encourage you in your walk with Christ. When life feels uncertain, when the road ahead is shrouded in darkness, we often want to have everything figured out before we take the next step. But God doesn't always give us the clarity we crave. He simply asks us to trust Him in the fog. Faith is not about having a roadmap to success, it's about trusting the one who holds the map. We must understand that God's plans for us are far greater than our ability to understand them, and this is where true faith is tested. Let me take you back to a time in my life where I found myself in a similar situation. I was facing a major decision, one that would change the course of my life, and yet, I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what was coming next, nor could I see how things would unfold. Have you ever been there? A place in your life where every step forward feels like walking through fog, where the future is unclear, and you feel like you're stumbling through the unknown. That was where I was. There were promises I was holding on to, but the future still felt uncertain. And yet, it was in this moment of uncertainty that God's voice became clearer than ever. God doesn't ask us to understand everything before we take a step. What He asks is that we trust Him. He asks that we believe that He is good, that His ways are higher than our ways, and that He is working all things together for good. When I was struggling with the unknown, I had to remind myself of this truth. I had to fight against my natural tendency to want certainty and control. The truth is, I don't have the ability to see all of God's plan. And neither do you. But I've learned something beautiful over the years. God's plan is greater than my limited understanding. I remember during this time of uncertainty, I kept thinking about Abraham and the calling God placed on his life. God didn't give Abraham a detailed blueprint of his journey. In fact, He called him to leave everything behind, to step out in faith without knowing where he was going. In Genesis 12 verse 1, God said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Now, I don't know about you, but if God called me to leave everything behind without telling me where I was going, I'd have a lot of questions. Abraham didn't know where he was going, but he trusted God's voice, and he obeyed. That's faith, taking the first step even when you can't see the whole road ahead. That's exactly what God calls us to do, to trust Him and take the step even when the road ahead is unclear. It's not about seeing the whole plan, it's about trusting the one who holds the plan. I had to choose to step out in faith, even when the road wasn't clear to me. God doesn't need us to have everything figured out before He acts. What He asks is for our obedience in the moment, our willingness to follow Him step by step. God leads us one step at a time. He gives us the light for the path that we're on today, but He doesn't always show us the end of the road. And that's okay. Faith is trusting God for what we don't see, not for what we already know. I also had to realize that God is not surprised by our uncertainty. He knows exactly where we are. In Psalm 139 verses 1 to 2, David writes, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar." God knows where we are on the road, even when we don't. And more importantly, He knows where He's leading us. Even in our uncertainty, God is in control. We are not walking in the dark, we are walking with the one who is the light of the world. And when we walk by faith, we do so with confidence that the God who has promised to guide us will never leave us or forsake us. Another aspect of walking by faith is realizing that obedience is not always comfortable, but it is always the right path. When I was faced with uncertainty, I didn't always feel like moving forward. I wanted to wait for clarity, wait for the fog to clear, wait for the perfect opportunity. But faith is not about waiting for perfect circumstances, it's about trusting God in the circumstances we have. There are moments in our walk with God when we simply need to obey, even when we don't have all the details. God calls us to walk by faith, not by sight. And when we walk by faith, we trust that He will provide the clarity in His time. We may not know the full picture, but we know the one who holds it. Walking by faith also means learning to let go of control. The truth is, we want to control our lives. We want to have the answers, we want to know what's coming next, and we want to avoid discomfort. But God's ways are often not our ways, and His timing is often different from ours. When I realized that God is in control of every detail, it brought me peace. I didn't need to know how everything was going to work out. I just needed to trust that God would lead me, step by step. In Isaiah 55 verses 8 to 9, we are reminded of God's sovereignty. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. This verse was a reminder that God's understanding far surpasses ours, and His plan is perfect, even when we can't see it. The road may not always be clear to us, but it's always clear to God. As I've walked through life's uncertainties, I've learned that the key to walking by faith is not in trying to control the outcome but in trusting God to control the outcome. God is faithful, and when we step out in faith, we can trust that He will lead us, guide us, and bring us to where we need to be. In conclusion, walking by faith when you can't see the road ahead is a decision to trust God. It's about obedience, stepping out in faith even when the road is unclear, and trusting that God will guide us in His perfect time. It's about choosing to trust in God's character and His promises, knowing that He is the one who holds the future. We may not see the road, but we know the one who goes before us. So, keep your eyes on Jesus, take that next step in faith, and trust that He will lead you. He is faithful to complete the work He has begun in you.